Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next webinar of the World Value Survey Association. Thank you for joining us today. The topic of our webinar today is the role of data and insights on public values and attitudes in international policymaking. It's a very important topic. Many of us conduct surveys. Many of us do surveys on values as a part of the World Value Survey or the European Values Study. But how do we translate these findings into meaningful insights and, more importantly, policy tools for policymakers? That's always a big question. And we are very happy and honored to have with us today the members of the World Value Survey and European Values Study team in the United Kingdom. Dr. Kirsty Hewlett is a Senior Research Fellow at the Policy Institute, King's College London. She is a co-investigator for the UK in WS and Principal Investigator for the EVS. Her research touches on a wide range of social policy areas with interests in public attitudes to poverty, inequalities, climate adaptation, and social division and migration policy, along with the role of values, trust, and inclusion in policymaking. And Kirsty is joined today by Dr. Paolo Morini, who is a research fellow at the Policy Institute, King's College London. He's also co-investigator for the UK in the WS. Paolo's research examines public opinion and public engagement with global challenges, including poverty, inequality, climate change, and international development. His methodological expertise is in the design and analysis of longitudinal and experimental studies, including policy evaluations in areas including democratic participation, young people's education, employment, and training outcomes. Kirsty and Paolo, thank you very much for joining us today, for your time. We greatly appreciate your expertise and very much look forward to hearing your insights and learning from you. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ksenia. And hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be online with you. Kirsty and I have prepared a presentation that will guide you through some of our insights on kind of the question of impact and engagement on studies like the World Value Survey and the European Value Studies. I think we're going to talk for about half an hour or 40 minutes. There's going to be a couple of opportunities through our presentation for you to ask questions. So we'll take a little break in between sections. And then we definitely have time at the end for discussion or Q&A on anything that you're interested in discussing a little bit more. With that in mind, let us get started. Ksenia has already done an excellent job of introducing us, for which we're very, very honored and humbled. But just to say, we work on both the World Value Survey and the European Value Studies. And really our approach to delivering both of these studies is, of course, delivering rigorous data collection exercises, but at the same time, core to our efforts and kind of overarching everything that we do is this approach to have far-reaching dissemination, engagement with policy, third sector, and media stakeholders and impact activities to raise the profile of the studies and raise the profile of the findings. Just to give you a sense of what we base our experience on today and what we base our insights on today, we ended up for World Value Survey Wave 7, generating more than 1,000 pieces of media coverage. And we now are the lucky owners of an extensive collection of citation in government documents and reports. Kirsty is also on the call. She will speak later in the presentation, but for now, you're with me. We'll do three things in this presentation, really. First is to review one of the studies that we published. It's the one that was attached to the invitation to this event, so you might have had a chance to read it. If not, don't worry, you will be guided through the entirety of it. And this is a part of our original grant for World Value Survey 7, for which we've investigated how data and insights on public values and attitudes can be used for international policymaking. We will then kind of, based on the experience that we had engaging policymakers and other stakeholders, talk about the kind of lessons learned from our work, kind of how to use data to do benchmarking, scene setting, how to enable policymakers to do strategic foresight, develop narratives to engage the public. We will look at the use cases for world value survey data across policymakers, third sector, media, organizations, and then talk about some of the challenges that the stakeholders have when they engage with data like world value survey. We'll take a second also to talk a little bit about impact, which is an increasingly important question for researchers and funders alike, so it should be useful. After a break for question, Kirsty will take it up and we will talk a little bit about putting it all into practice and kind of reflecting on World Value Survey 7 research as a whole and saying, how do we deliver our engagement model now using this idea of the early targeted and continuous engagement approach? Good. Starting from the original study that we conducted in 2024, this was part of our efforts to disseminate World Value Survey 7. We wanted to engage our network of 22,000 contacts. The Policy Institute at King's, for those that don't know it too well, is less a classical academic department and more a kind of knowledge transfer unit, a political and policy engagement unit. So we're situated in the middle of this kind of extensive media policy third sector network, and we wanted to use it to increase the visibility of World Value Survey 7. In this case, really, we were interested in taking the data for a spin almost and really showing what you can do with World Value Survey 7 data once you analyze it and use it to discuss a question which is like, what does it tell us when it comes to challenges like migration politics, security policies, and trade policies? To do this, we used the entire integrated value studies set from 1981 and 2022 and answered questions around where is the UK compared to other countries in the world, our values and attitudes changing, and what does that tell us about the policy challenges we're thinking about. We then used this analysis to convene a group of about 30 participants, which came from 16 different organizations, including the government, the third sector, and the media. So the analysis is just the first part of this. It's really more about how the stakeholders and the people that came to the workshop engaged with it and discussed it. That helped us investigate what matters most to policymakers, how the data are useful, and what is missing for them to be more used in a context of policymaking like this. The real point here to begin with, and it will be a kind of thread that runs through the presentation today, is an effort to go from the complex longitudinal cross-sectional data that all of you will be used to seeing when you work with World Value Survey and European Value Study, and to digest it in a form that becomes accessible and actionable from the policy stakeholders. So at the core of this was a report, which is more or less what we're presenting today. And then on top of the core report, which is what presented throughout the day, we had 3 smaller thematic reports that made the specific case of data about migration, data about security, data about trade, and how this can be used more specifically to be applied in that context. But within all the reports and the outputs that we prepared as part of this research, we were guided by the principle that data visualization and key insights, so narrating the findings and visualizing the findings, is what makes the data more accessible. There are a couple of examples on the slide, but I'll guide you through it as I present the rest of the study. As I said, though, the most important part of this workshop was less for us to impart the knowledge, to present the results, to discuss the insights, and more for stakeholders to get their hands on the data. For example, we directly asked them, what do you think are the barriers and the opportunities to using data like the World Value Survey? And as you can see, with post-its and practical activities, people could think out loud about kind of, oh, this is really interesting for me, this kind of insight about where the UK sits compared to the rest of the world. Or I really cannot do this because I'm lacking the skills to understand data that are as complex as this, is one of the activities that we did through the workshop. The other thing that stakeholders really enjoyed is this idea that it's not just about learning something, but it's about learning something that challenges your assumptions. So the little figure that you see here on the right, it's almost a sort of game in which we ask them, if you were in some sort of kind of value space and one that is plotted on top of the kind of idea that democracy can be backsliding or becoming more stable. Where do you think each of these countries are? And as you can see, when we split into groups, there were 5 people. There was definitely some uncertainty about the position of the US or the position of South Korea. So the idea is not just that they learned something new, but it's also that they challenge what they know about their preconceptions and their safe-held knowledge by using World Value Survey, which is higher quality data and higher quality of insights. And finally, these are the 3 more specific migration insights that we shared with them. We could do a seminar on each of these, so I'm keeping it quite brief, and I apologize for being really, really quick. But we split the 30 people into the relevant kind of areas of expertise and interest. In migration, we showed how statistically you can calculate models that allow you to find an association between migration attitudes and policy attitudes towards migration with actual concrete migration policies to say these are important things that are associated across countries and that one reflects the other without meaning to go into the discussion around causality. The other insight in trade as well, it was using values and attitudes data to show that the UK is more likely to trade with countries that has more value alignment with, and specifically, I think, it's the first point on the list that there is 971 pounds per capita more value in trade with countries that are more aligned with the UK in the way of kind of values and attitudes. And then in the way of security, we've also used an interesting case study, which was voting on the resolution in the United Nations to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And even here, the kind of secular and survival and traditional and secular values mapped significantly on top of voting records. So values and attitudes as the undercurrent of policies in migration, trade, and security was the point of discussion across all of these groups. What we learned by putting all of these insights and by organizing these activities and by sharing these outputs with our group of policymakers. First and foremost, and I can never get tired saying this, where the World Value Survey really shines in the eyes of stakeholders is benchmarking. This might seem perhaps basic, and to some of us it will be a granted and taken for granted kind of view of the study of World Value Survey, perhaps, but it really is a question that is of real importance to policymakers. How does the UK, in our case, compare to other countries on a specific issue? Is there kind of a sense that the UK is close to the countries that we consider ourselves similar to, the countries that we want to interact with, the countries that we want to have relationships with, or are we kind of standing apart? So it's the exercise of both identifying common ground, so countries with which we share values and challenges, and divergences. So kind of, is there an opportunity for these countries to become more or less similar as time passes? And will that create strategic opportunities for us to invest in different policy decisions? On top of benchmarking, then it's the foresight element that connects to this. The idea that you can use a time series so far reaching back in time is enormously valuable to stakeholders that we've engaged with. And the idea really here is across these domains of politics, everybody was thinking it's important to use this data to anticipate changing opinions and governance systems. So a bit like we were sharing in the previous slide, the capacity to say this country is at risk of democratic backsliding, or the values and attitudes gap between this and that country is opening up, and identifies opportunities and challenges for the policymakers deciding on how to action their levers of power in the country that you are thinking about. But equally importantly, also the capacity to use the World Value Survey data to identify spaces where policy change is or isn't permissible within the parameters of public opinion. So again, more at the foundation of the policy choice, but to try and understand, in the case of migration, for example, is it possible to move migration politics in a more liberal, more open direction, or does the public think it's going to go into a more conservative, stricter, and closer direction? In the case of the UK, for example, we had identified that given the state to public opinion, there are real opportunities for the system of policy response to migration to become more liberal, but the direction of the policy was the opposite. It became stricter by the time that we had done the research, which shows a kind of strategic challenge for the policymakers, either on the way to communicate these choices or to try and understand how the government works in an environment of policy and public opinion that are incongruent. And so to that connects the idea of narratives, right? So the idea of using insights and attitudes and values to inform the way these policy choices are presented, they're framed, they're communicated, both to build public support in certain situations, but also to try and understand public dissent in others and navigate those disjointed situations from the more congruent ones. It's important to also say kind of this is a space where policymakers noted that there might be misperceptions. So the public is not necessarily holding the perfect information and does not know how everything is actually working and does not understand the strategic landscape that faces the difficulty choices of policymakers. So it's important to use this data also as a way to understand where the public is literally at with the knowledge and understanding and support of the issues that are at hand. But also really implicitly and at the core of this, there was a real sense that it's important to think of foreign policy as an expressive function of what the UK is in the international arena. And so having the capacity of saying this policy is based on the values and attitudes of the country, in this case, the UK, was seen as an important way of not just communicating it, but also really expressing the importance of the policy choice itself. Here are some examples of what we talked about, especially about benchmarking and trajectories in the way we presented them. This is one of our most important findings from Wave 7 of the World Values Survey. And it's this idea that Great Britain and the UK, more in general, is one of the most trusting countries in the world. This both corrected a misperception that the press and policymakers had, that so the UK is kind of closed off, not really as trusting as other countries. And also it's, as you see, it's somewhat immediate in the way you can then rank Great Britain among a set of 30 countries that we've chosen by finding both countries that are similar to us and countries that are not as similar to us in this type of analysis, and by providing the sense, as you see in the column of right, that we rank second in this list of countries, third, first, or first. So kind of that trust is really high in GB compared to other countries. And stakeholders were, I would say, almost surprised to find this out, because they were probably thinking about this starting from a position that was meaningfully different in their knowledge of how trust works. And then trajectories. This is an exercise we did to try and explain to them the idea of moving into the value space in this kind of traditional secular or survival self-expression space, and to see how Great Britain has changed in time. Just the capacity of kind of charting this data this way and using the entire time series to calculate the indices and then show the movement really kind of makes material what is instead a difficult or theoretical concept for a policymaker that does not have the time, the willingness sometimes, or the resources to engage with things as complex as this. Use cases is what we looked at next. And in this case, we wanted to work a little bit more in a divided fashion across the three core groups that we've invited. For policymakers, really, the core use cases reflect the discussion that we've had before. In the case of migration, the point is kind of asking question and informing policy designs and anticipating challenges with the delivery and communication to the public. In trade, the bit that was most important was this value attitudinal alignment and forecasting future political stability, because this will define their choices around trade relationship. And then in the case of security, different frames for diplomatic efforts affect kind of the efficacy of the efforts themselves. So kind of framing it around values as a way of finding shared ground in decisions that affect security policy. In the third sector, this kind of detaches quite a lot from the decision point or evidencing policymaking choices, and it goes instead towards a lot more lobbying efforts. So bringing in evidence that says policymakers should move in this direction. It will give a clearer understanding of the context, the options, and the opinions of the public. But also to try, for people that are interested, to bridge that public opinion and policy gap. And this is kind of with an implicit agenda of the stakeholders that we engaged with that says that we should have less elite-driven decisions and more about decisions that could be built and built by public support for specific policies. And then, of course, with both the third sector and the media, highlighting opportunities for counter-narrative campaigning. Again, think about the finding around trust, this idea that you can tell people what you think about trust is not necessarily true, identifies opportunities for counter-narrative campaigning and engaging the public on political issues that matter. For the media, the main way in which they want to engage with this data and the way we've also engaged with them is to use empirical evidence as a corrective. I'll show you an example in a while, but a lot of our continuous presence in the media is about saying, if you look at very high quality data, which is what the World Value Survey presents, then this finding is not necessarily true. This held assumption does not necessarily hold. There's a lot of kind of correcting what our beliefs or misinformation held in the public. And this is especially true when it comes to understanding longer term trends. We didn't look at trust in institution as much in this, but in a second stakeholders lab that we did, part of our effort was really to tell the difference between what is a crisis in trust and a chronic problem of trust in the UK. And that insight alone was very important for people in the room, because a lot of people tend to talk about trust in institution as a crisis for democracies now. In the UK, really, that's mostly not the case. Trust is low and has been low for a very long time. And that's an important corrective to try and understand what's the problem at stake and what can you do to try and solve it. But also importantly, to hold decision makers to account. And again, this idea that if there's a gap between public opinion and policy, there is opportunities for kind of shaping the way decisions are made by policymakers or decision makers who use the media to inform themselves or to understand what the public debate is like on certain issues. This is an example of our policy impact. There was a report published in 2025 on future trends for Scotland, as always in that kind of strategic foresight function. And the way it looked is a bit by kind of taking some of our data. But as you can see, most of what it's doing in this presentation is to set the scene, benchmark the UK across other countries, give a sense of how this is changing, if it's changing, and then do a little bit of kind of landscape and understanding of what the issues are. In this case, what they were interested in was our point about trust and political polarization. And this is an example of the media coverage. Sorry. You see kind of another corrective that bases itself on benchmarking. This is from 2025 as well, using World Value Survey data to find out that actually compared to confidence in government and parliament, the confidence is a lot higher in European Union institutions. If you even remotely follow the Brexit discourse around the UK, you will know this is a enormously contentious and everlasting issue in the UK political discourse. But having a point of evidence here shows actually, compared to the domestic institution, the European Union institutions hold more confidence in the eyes of British people. These are the three core challenges that we wanted to share, though, because so far all of you seen our opportunities, interest, and things that people want to do with World Value Survey and European Value Study data. One, concerns about data availability. There are really enormous kind of sources of data out there that are available to policymakers. So a part of the effort is to cut through the noise. But it's worth noting again that policymakers are aware that there is a difference in quality. And if they are kind of engaged on the ground, that explains World Value Survey is higher quality data for the way that it's collected and nationally representative samples and fieldwork done in the way that we do it, then they will see the difference between World Value Survey and the occasional online sample. Nevertheless, it's a crowded information environment. Secondly, the kind of topical coverage was one of the main issues. You can imagine if you've worked with the World Value Survey that engaging people on issues like migration, where there are few questions available, then they think, well, we could use a more specialized study to better inform the way we take decisions. And then on benchmarking, this is the inevitable pain of statistical analysis. Everybody enjoyed the simplicity and the capacity of saying, oh, the UK ranks first, trust is high here. 89% of the people trust people of a different religion. But then practically the distribution became an issue of concern for people. So in other words, kind of people want to know more and want to have more complex insights, but they also want these insights to be simple enough and accessible enough. You are fighting battles on two fronts on how to make this accessible and available to them in a way that policymakers can readily use them. Connectedly, skills. There is a real lack in all the organizations that we work with, at least in the UK, of people and skills that can or are willing or have time to directly manipulate, analyze, and interpret the data. Sometimes there are people that are very much statistically literate and that they have knowledge of how to use the World Value Survey, but most of the time, really, there isn't a dedicated function to do the analysis and to extract the insight that these people need to inform their decisions. That's where we as a policy institute sometimes intervene by providing that analysis directly, which gives kind of chances for impact. But it is still kind of within the organization themselves, the complexity or the lack of resources is hard to overcome. But on that sense, kind of participants still highlighted, and it's worth sharing with everybody today, the importance and how well received the efforts are to make the data and finding more accessible. So the idea is to try and really understand how an unspecialized audience can engage with the study itself without having to incur into that extra people time or skill cost. At the same time, still maintaining that there's a methodological robustness argument to be made for them. And finally, operationalization. As you've seen from all of my discussion, really, where World Value Survey is more valuable is the setting the scene, benchmarking, thinking about landscapes and understanding where people are at or countries are at. So, of course, the other side of the same coin is kind of how do you inform a practical and specific decision with insights that are broader becomes a challenge for the people that we've engaged with. And also equally kind of connectedly for civil servants, understanding how to take what the data say, so the broader insight, and then connecting it to a specific decision itself. Most of the time, our data, for example, says 80% of the people support immigrants coming to live in the UK, for example. But practically, what does that mean in a situation in which we're asking whether we should have a points-based immigration system or a visa-based immigration system? What's a challenge that they couldn't necessarily overcome within the workshops that we convened in 2024, 2025. And then participants also noted a broader discussion and really on whether this data should be used at all. And this is the eternal kind of expert evidence-based policymaking or public opinion as and public engagement as a source of kind of policy decision insight. And this is kind of part of that, how to operationalize the importance of the public opinion insight as part of all the other sources of evidence that inform the policy itself. So these three are the ones most important that we gather by discussion with everybody. A few final words from me on impact, which connects to the discussion we've had so far. If you are in countries like the UK, this is becoming an increasing important concern for funders to evidence that the study has had a direct, traceable effect by you conducting the study itself. But the truth of it is actually with stuff and studies like World Value Survey, their impact will be a lot more diffused and a lot harder to trace directly. So if on one hand, the kind of you can trace the citation in the policy documents and the evidence that I got used in decisions or to inform policies, this will be spare examples. We have a fair collection of this, which is easier to document, but it's harder to obtain. But what we wanted to argue is the importance of actually understanding the indirect impact of a project like World Value Survey. And in our case, for example, the way we think about it is the graph that you see there in the bottom is the number of times somebody cited the World Value Survey in the UK. We were kind of started to work on it in 2021, 2022, even 2020 probably. And you can see there's been a large increase in the use of World Value Survey in UK research. That is not direct impact because they're not all articles that we wrote ourselves or citations that we did ourselves. But at the same time, it shows that the World Value Survey is visible, is used, and it is informing choices in policy, and it is informing policy research, and it is informing even academic research. So it's an important kind of game and understanding that there are going to be impact sources both in these channels and to try and narrate the importance of World Value Survey across these two worlds of impact itself. With that, I think we've got some time for questions if anybody has any on anything that you've seen.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Do we have any questions to Paolo? I remind you that you can write your question if you cannot speak, or you can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and share your question or comment. And while everyone is thinking, let me ask you, Paolo, I have actually a couple of questions. So I also read the report, the article that we also shared with the colleagues when inviting them, and it notes that policymakers, they might lack this technical capacity to analyze the W's data. What would be your recommendation to all of us? So what would an accessible yet rigorous but policy-facing version of W analysis look like?
There is a couple of kind of responsive things that you can do and a couple of default things that you can provide. In the UK, definitely all of our stakeholders are used to working with data tables. So frequency of the distributions, just getting tables that says this is the response overall for the sample broken down by age groups, gender groups, income groups, et cetera, et cetera. It's of course easier to prepare those kind of tables for one country at a time. Otherwise, you end up in some sort of Excel statistical mayhem situation of an infinity of Excel sheets of data. But people are kind of pretty satisfied and pretty independent in use of data tables. The other things is kind of skipping the data altogether and going straight to the reports and the results. And most of the time, when people engage with the data visualizations, those tend to get a life of their own. If you've seen before on the example that we had on the slides on the Scottish report on Scottish futures, that chart that you see on the right is lifted directly from one of our reports and inserted straight into their own kind of futures thing. So in the sense, the data did its job and there was no analysis or manipulation from their side. There was just interpretation and then used to inform their foresight report. But it did the trick. So if you can digest it directly for them and create the data visualization, they will engage with that. The other thing that we've done more and more through what Kirsty will talk about in a bit, we have an advisory board, is to be responsive. And it's this idea that people will come to you with questions, and that has happened to us, at least kind of government-wise, in 6 or 7 notable occasions in the past 2 to 3 years, in which people just came to us and they said, we have this question about young people perception of the elections in the UK. What can you tell us? And then we say, here is a new report. So kind of bridging that gap by providing the analysis capability in-house where possible. But yeah, it's a combination of kind of those data tables and this responsiveness thing. We've had a long-standing dream of creating an interactive data dashboard in which people can manipulate the data and create their own charts. So far, we didn't come around to building it yet, but that, of course, would be the final kind of level of independent querying of the data that could become a little bit more accessible. And increasingly, probably with AI, those solutions will become more commonly used for projects like World Value Survey.
Thank you very much, Paula. Do we have any more questions?
I have a question. Are you producing policy briefs for different departments, or what is the format you're approaching the British government? Send it to certain ministries or to certain press officers or desk officers?
Mhm.
So what is your policy as a policy institute?
Yeah, so there's a combination of, let's say, close friends and a larger group of acquaintances. The project that, as Kirsty will talk about, has close working relationship with the Minister for Housing, Local Communities, which has been with us since World Value Survey 7. They have a real interest in understanding how attitudes and values vary across the UK nations. They even funded some boosted data collection. So they are in the advisory board, and they get to engage with us by saying these are our priorities. But Kirsty will talk a little bit more about that aspect in a second. So that bit is kind of built in the continuous engagement that we do of key stakeholders. On top of that, there's a real kind of exploiting the opportunities of engaging the larger audiences, because at least in the UK, all of these government departments organize this learning sessions or workshop days in which they will invite hundreds to 100, 300 of people. And it's just by showcasing World Value Survey as part of the things that get presented at this workshop that we then expand our networks. And that's how we got in touch with the Electoral Commission, the people that wanted insights about young people in election. That's how we got in touch with people from the Northern Ireland office. And then through other research that we do at the Policy Institute, we had connections with the Welsh government. It's a combination of proactive and reactive engagement that allows us to automatically disseminate the core reports and then gathering in the demand for additional kind of research. But yeah, that's all part two, and Kirsty will share a lot more punctual insight about this in a second.
I have a second small question. The House of Lords is doing sometimes a scientific inquiry into certain topics. Is your institute also delivering some results to the House of Lords, or you're just talking to the government?
We definitely saw World Value Survey data cited on the official records of Parliament. I do not remember if it was exactly the Lords. And we have a working relationship with the Houses of Parliament's library. So the briefing insights that get disseminated to the parliamentarians sometimes include World Value Survey data. In the way of kind of responding to queries and requests for evidence, I don't think we directly ever participated in that. But Kirsty might know more than me because she's been around for Wave 7 for the entire time. A young one.
I was only asking because social scientists in Britain are sometimes invited to come to the House of Lords and to give some statements. And I was wondering if this happened also to you. It's just out of curiosity, because the British government, unlike continental governments, is more open to public policy advice from social science than the Europeans. I think that's an advantage in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. In the meantime, we have two questions in chat, but it's up to you and Christy whether you would like to take them now or at the end.
They're pretty quick. Yeah. I'll respond now. Thank you, Amy. We're not using AI in any specific way at the moment to disseminate and understand the survey data. Yali, you're asking about if we have applied our findings to regulators. We had some experience. We've done another policymakers and stakeholders lab, all on the question of trust and polarization. And we have engaged the independent office for kind of press regulation and the police conduct. So kind of regulators of that kind, not financial regulators directly, or at least not from memory. Again, Kirsty can confirm, but I don't think we did. And in that case, really the conversation was about whether levels of trust in this institution are now, again, chronically low, or there is a crisis in trust, and what are the drivers that we can push and pull to rebuild this trust, and what kind of narratives we can build. So all of that was more directly aimed at rebuilding this relationship with trust. That might be a bit of a UK specific policy application case, because most of our institutions really have very low, chronically low levels of trust. So in our case, we then tried and understand really the nature of that using the trend data, and then we connected it to the problem of political polarization by arguing that actually both kind of feed on each other. So we were going after a more specific bit. You were asking because trust in central banks might become a bigger challenge than inflation. Yes, I think it's definitely one I was thinking about as well with the landscape that we're in at the moment. But no, I don't think we've done anything more specifically about financial institutions just yet. I'll be optimistic.
Thank you very much, Paolo. So I suggest we carry on with Kirsti's part of the presentation, and then we will be available for more questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ksenia. Yeah, so what Paolo's talked to you through so far is sort of our learnings from the last wave. And just for like the last sort of 5-10 minutes or so, I'm just going to say a bit about how we're taking those forwards into the current round. So as Paolo and Ksenia mentioned, we're kind of wrapping up field work on WVS8 at the moment within the UK, and also just about to start European Value Study 6 as well. So it's a big year for us in terms of data collection, and very excited that that will be coming through. And I think there are quite a few things we're doing a bit differently off the back of the learnings in Wave 7 that we just thought would be interesting to share as a little kind of addendum. Can you click through, think, Paolo? And again, as we sort of touched on before, this emphasis on kind of early, targeted, and continuous engagement is really fundamental to how we're delivering these survey infrastructures in the UK. And as I think the discussion's just touched on really well, it's fundamentally about building relationships. And I think this is what's a bit different to what we were doing in the last wave, where we were focused more on like, we'll deliver these workshops with these themes, etc. Now our focus is really on building relationships rather than kind of delivering discrete events, and the kind of events fall out of those conversations. So as I say, it's a bit different to what we were doing in the previous wave, but I also think it's quite a big shift from how a lot of projects think about dissemination, engagement, and impact as well, where you do data collection, you do your analysis, and then you kind of take it out to the world and kind of do the impact bit as a final step. And for us, having that as a kind of continuous thing that runs alongside data collection that starts even before you've started looking at questionnaires is really important. And it's a really key thing for making the data relevant to stakeholders and accessible for all the reasons Paolo has just mentioned. And I think that kind of how do you make the data relevant to stakeholders is really interesting in studies like WVS, where you've obviously got a kind of questionnaire that's set centrally. You've got questions that have kind of been asked for nearly 50 years now. So there's not a lot of scope in terms of changing that sort of thing. But I do think some of the things we've done in the UK show that there is a lot of scope for things to be done that, listens to what stakeholders are asking for. So just one example of how we've done that in the UK is around boosts in the nation. So the UK isn't one nation, it's 4. So made up of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. But actually, when you take a UK nationally representative sample, Wales and Northern Ireland in particular come out so small that you'd never be able to kind of study those countries in isolation. So one of the things we've done in the last wave and in this wave through early engagement with government, particularly with the Cabinet Office, is to really invest in those boost samples within the nations outside of England to make sure that every single country within the UK can be studied independently with countries all around the world. And as Paolo mentioned, that's been a really important part of people picking up that data and benchmarking it. So you'll see that the report that Paolo cited earlier was one from the Scottish Government. We've had similar examples from Northern Ireland Executive, Northern Ireland Office as well, that are using the data in a similar way. Can you pop to the next slide, Paolo? And as Paolo touched on earlier, I think this early engagement, we'll talk about it a lot, but it does also need to be paired with this responsiveness and reactive thing. So what we really value about that early engagement is it does create these opportunities for repeated touch points. So as people get to know us, they get to know the infrastructure. When a question pops up where people are like, oh, that might be in the World Value Surveys, we'll send those guys an email. It creates those relationships that mean people come to us for kind of answers to questions in a slightly more timely way. It identifies new opportunities as kind of new policy agendas come forward, and also, those people we engage with early, they become much more invested in the study and they act as champions for the data as well. And I think particularly with things like the devolved governments in the UK, so things like Scottish Government, Welsh Government, Northern Ireland Executive, a lot of them have kind of central analysis teams. And so actually building relationships with those people has become really, really important for us, because they then kind of become the conduit for the data into all sorts of different policy areas. So to your question earlier, Christian, about ministries, they kind of mean we can tap into multiple different kind of policy sectors within a government. But that doesn't take away from, as I say, this kind of responsive approach being really important. So one of the things we did in the last wave, as Paolo mentioned, is to really try and have this continuous presence for the study in UK media. And so that was through a series of thematic releases that we released every 3 or 4 weeks. And it meant within actually one wave, we accounted for like half of the media coverage that there's ever been for the WVS in the UK since the study began. So it was quite an important and powerful campaign. But one of the really important things of that is it drew lots of new stakeholders to us. So, for example, we had MPs emailing us that had seen the data on the BBC or something like that, that were coming to us for kind of like bespoke cuts of analysis. So it was quite important for building new relationships, and also ongoing impact monitoring as well. So we really get a sense of how and where the data is being used. If we don't know these people, we try and email them, we try and get in touch to kind of, again, build those relationships moving forwards. And that allows us both to keep audiences warm, but it also means we can keep our ear to the ground in terms of shifting priorities, shifting needs, to make sure what we're delivering is kind of timely. And I think the kind of breadth of the WVS questionnaire in particular, and the EVS questionnaires, are such wonderful assets in being able to have that kind of responsiveness and agility. Next slide, please. And I think just to kind of talk a bit about how we're applying early engagement. We talk about early engagement, but like, what are the mechanisms for it? So in World Values Survey 8 and EVS 6, there are really 3 core components in terms of how we've built that into our research design. Again, it feels quite basic, but really fundamentally working in partnership is hugely important. And really, I think, essential for ensuring that our team have the experience and networks and profile to work with integrity. So since we first sort of took over as UK leads for WVS, we've worked closely with the Social Change Initiative, who are a brilliant organisation in Northern Ireland, who have really sort of taken that data and connected it out into communities. So they've done a lot of work where they kind of use WVS as a starting point for a discussion around kind of working through divides, around kind of peace building, etc. But also methodologically with the ESS team at City St George's as well. So it's not just on the kind of like policy and impact engagement that we're kind of building these partnerships, but also on the methodological side too. And also another part of partnership is we do have formal partnerships with government as well. So in WVS, they've funded, as Paolo mentioned, boost samples in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So that's UK government departments, but also devolved governments, charities, philanthropic funders. And in EVS 6, we're kind of looking to push those relationships in sort of devolved contexts a bit more. So have kind of formal partnerships with the Scottish Government, and policy-wise at the Open University, which are really about kind of doing devolution well, I guess, and sort of building knowledge and awareness of these kind of different institutions and different structures that the UK have. So that partnership, I think, has connected us into so many useful places in policy. And again, it's that investment in those relationships that really matters. But we also have an advisory board. So this is made up of a group of 17 brilliant people who are from across government, academics, journalists, think tanks. And we consult with them kind of periodically through the life cycle of a project, but we try to make those touch points be really meaningful. So there's always something they can shape and that we want them to shape to ensure that what we're doing is responsive. So, for example, the first meeting of the WVS 8 advisory board was to kind of stress test and think up things that we can be adding to those country-specific questions to make sure that we can really kind of squeeze out every kind of bit of value in that questionnaire for different stakeholders in the UK. But we also do consultations as well. So these are more kind of like one-to-one semi-structured interviews with people like civil servants, charities, think tanks, academics. This time around, we've also done them with national surveys, so surveys that are just running Scotland, just running Wales, Northern Ireland, etc., which have been hugely valuable for seeing how all of these infrastructures kind of can become mutually reinforcing, what their kind of individual benefits are as well. So I think these conversations have been really important in understanding use cases for the data, what people need from those kind of country-specific questions, and in informing the kind of design choices we make to really try and make sure the data gets used and is front of mind for people. And there, just to sort of share a few examples, there's lots of things that have come out of those discussions already. So as I say, we're wrapping up fieldwork now for WVS8, but there's lots of things we're already thinking about and we've already embedded into how we're working. So number one, fieldwork timing. We've had two very high profile elections in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So through those consultations, we paused fieldwork for their pre-election periods, which obviously doesn't apply to other bits of the UK. This early engagement's also fully shaped the questions we're asking that just for the UK. So through the consultations, we came up with this long list of topics that were coming up as really going to enhance the kind of common core. So things around national identity, Brexit, attitudes to devolved institutions and systems. These are all things that people are saying, well, this data isn't going to be useful unless I can kind of distinguish between the UK government and the Scottish government, for example. So that's really fundamentally shaped the sort of bits of the questionnaire that we can change. They shape things like the focus of thematic releases. So what are the big policy issues that people are talking about? And that's something we'll continue to coming back to as the data comes in. Also points around data accessibility as well. So as Paolo mentioned, data tables can be an enormously useful way to get people using the data, to not have those bottlenecks going through our team in terms of the analysis. But one of the things that came out of those interviews was actually the enormous value that there would be to just be like having an England-specific data set, a Wales-specific data set that enables people within those countries to just sort of pick up the data and use it. And various ideas for capacity building as well. So the kind of skills points that we heard in WVS7 when we were doing the policy engagement came up in these consultations as well. And part of kind of bringing in that skills base within governments, for example, was around embedding PhD students in governments for kind of short stints, for short placements, where they can kind of bring that data into decision making. Seminars and methodological learnings, guides to work with the data, etc. So there's a lot we're already doing, a lot we're already changing in our approach just off the back of those early consultations that we've been running. And I think I'll pull a few specific things out of here and then we'll wrap up. So we've got time for a few more questions. But a lot of what we're doing when we're thinking about these activities is what are the key interests for these different stakeholder groups? What are the challenges we can kind of, what are the channels, sorry, we can kind of leverage to make sure we're reaching the right people, and then, what outputs kind of help us get there. And for some, they're kind of, the interests are the same, others are different. But I think particularly for like engaging the media and the public, which I think is a part of the brief, Ksenia, that you kind of wanted us to come and talk about in government, these salient, surprising, compelling findings that kind of are a bit of a corrective to what, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are as a nation are hugely helpful in terms of kind of getting people's interest, getting them kind of thinking about the insights that the data have. And I think our strategy for kind of getting that out in terms of the media has always been kind of press releasing, potentially, having these kind of story-led outputs that don't try and take the whole questionnaire, but take even some of them, just take one or two variables from WVS, but kind of look at them from lots of different angles, lots of different breaks, comparisons, etc. And so kind of less is more, I think, in terms of how you're putting a lot of those stories together. But also media partnerships can be really helpful as well in terms of getting that kind of depth of coverage that can be helpful. So giving people early access to something that's going to be something that's going to come out through a press release, for etc. Make sure that someone will be covering what you're putting out, I guess. And then we talked a lot about government policy and third sector organizations, but again, this sort of like being responsive to the questions people are asking here has been so important for us. So again, some of that engagement can be based on a single question. So some of our engagement with the regulators has been based on the confidence in police question, for example, and that's then been taken into team meetings and discussed. So those briefings are hugely important for us to kind of spark these conversations, but then kind of take on a life of their own in other institutions. But yeah, I think I will stop there just so we've got a few minutes for questions. But I hope that was helpful, and do reach out to us via email as well if you've got any further questions after the session. Ksenia, I think you're on mute.
You have to unmute yourself first.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kirsten, Paolo, for your excellent presentation. We have a few minutes left, so if there is any question or comment that anyone would like to share, please post
I
it
think
quickly.
Margaret wants to say something. Margaret.
I have a question, please.
Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you for the excellent presentation, and very happy to see Christine and Ksenia after a long time. Actually, I have a question for Paolo. Paolo, you mentioned that one of the good things about World Value Survey is that not only to learn something, but to learn something that challenges what you believe. And when you mention that, do you have in mind the policymaker or do you have in mind academia? Because usually policymaker, at least from my experience, they would like to confirm conventional wisdom, not really to challenge what they know already. What do you think about that in your experience? And my second question also is related to whether you interact with the media and what is your experience about interacting with the media. Thank you very much.
In our experience, a lot of the work we've done was to kind of correct misperceptions using World Value Survey data. And in our workshops, the civil servants and the policymakers we have engaged with were pretty receptive to it. Keeping in mind that most of the time, again, we're doing at the World Value Survey level. So it's more of a kind of, you might think X, but actually Y. So there isn't a specific, your policy is wrong, which I think would be more confrontational and less well received. But just to give you an example, one of the questions that we got from our partnership with the devolved administration and the nations of the UK was a real concern that the UK is coming apart, that the nations are not very similar anymore, and that the union is at risk because devolution will push each nation to go in a separate direction. And our research actually most of the time was to show this is not happening, that countries across the UK are all pretty similar from the point of view of values and attitudes. And that was an important corrective for the discourse within the local communities minister, because they were chasing a problem of this kind of push with devolution making us more unalike, that at least our evidence is showing it really isn't there at the level that you think it is. But that helps reframe the discussion around kind of, is it because the groups that seek for further devolution are louder in the sphere of the discourse? So it's a problem of who gets heard? Is it a problem of the kind of policy making these outcomes more likely, but at the moment those differences in the way of values and attitudes are not there? So every time we've done something like that, it's been well received. There's been another very visible study that said in the UK, very large majority of all young people wanted a dictator. We then had to go to the press and say, well, actually, if you use proper survey evidence of a well-collected sample, that is just not there. And that again was well received by both the policymakers, the media, and the academic community that said, good, that's why you have the World Value Survey sample there. That's why you collect the very high quality data, because it serves as a counterfactual to quicker, sometimes lower value studies. The engagement with the media, Kirsty can say a little bit more, but in our kind of experience, there's always been enormous interest as long as what you're providing them with is topical. So it speaks to something that is going on in the debate. It tells a story of change. So every time our PI, Bobby Duffy, wants to speak about kind of generational change and long-term trends, then the media will publish it inevitably. Or when it does this kind of correction piece. So every time we say, look, there is no problem with devolution pulling us further apart from each other. The real problem is people do not have confidence in the central government and everybody has the same problem across the nation. Then that's been well received. Again, I think we're well above 1,000 pieces of media coverage for this project. So once you develop those initial relationships and you have spaces and we have good relationship with a few specific broadcasters, then other opportunities kind of present themselves. To just give comment or to write other pieces then adds to that capacity of being present and to be a kind of science communicator almost in their eyes, which helps.
Thank you.
I would just add to that, Paolo, as well. Like, I think our first release that we did from the data was on migration, and the findings in the data ran completely counter to any narrative that was happening around how people in the UK think about migration at the time, because we were showing as being like one of the most positive countries towards immigration in Europe, which I think has since changed again. But like it was just so at odds with how that was being talked about in the media. But that's like quite a big story, and we definitely do see, just to kind of confirm your suspicion, we do see other cases where people go, this confirms the thing I want to talk about. So if you look at some of the House of Lords debates that the data's been cited in, it is people saying the World Values Survey data tells us that people think this is important, so therefore I'm now going to introduce the thing I want to debate. Like it's definitely used in that confirmatory way as well, and I don't think we're kind of changing people's minds every time they use it, but it's still, as Paolo kind of set up, it's still setting the context for the thing, the more detailed thing that people now then go on to want to introduce. But yeah, I think just to add that on the agenda, on the end there.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. So let me ask one more last time if anyone has a question or a comment that you would like to share. And since this is not the case, I would like to thank once again Paolo and Kirsty for excellent presentation. We very much look forward to seeing the data set for the United Kingdom, and eventually once the data is published, hopefully next year, to analyzing it all together alongside with other countries. If you still have any questions to Paolo or Kirsty, how to communicate your survey results to the policymakers in your country, I hope both colleagues are available by email, so you're welcome to contact Paolo and Kirsty anytime. Thank you very much for joining us today. The video recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, so if you missed the beginning or the middle part or any part, you are welcome to watch it from tomorrow onwards. Paul and Kirsty, would you like to have the last word?
Just to say thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure to discuss this. And yeah, once the recording and slides are circulated, you will have our contact details. No question is too small, no question is bad. So get in touch if you want to discuss anything.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.